It's my honor to introduce the new president of our college, Dr. Cheryl Roberts, who's going to introduce the speaker.
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much. There is a lot to be said about our speaker, and I want to make sure I cover it well. Hold on for just a second. Well, first of all, before I have my formal remarks, I want to thank you all for coming. We are very proud of our global studies program and our global affairs series. Yes, it's the second in our series, and we're pleased that we are engaging our community and our students. So let me begin by saying I'm very honored to introduce Professor Mark McLeod from Seattle University. He is here to talk about changes taking place in relations between Cuba and the United States, and about how the Cuban government and Cuban citizens see themselves and the U.S. and the rest of the world. For those of you who were alive during the earlier parts of our relationship with Cuba, let me share with you, or for those who weren't, let me share with you some of the things about that relationship over the last 50 years. In 1959, the 1959 revolution and the deterioration of relations that followed, the commercial, economic, and financial embargo imposed by the U.S. on Cuba started in October of 1960. In April of 1961, the failed Bay of Pigs invasion by Cuban exiles, and the Cuban Missile Crisis when the Soviet Union sought to place nuclear missiles aimed at the U.S. government. In the past few years, things have gotten better, and in fact, many of them are calling it the Cuban thaw. There have been lots of improvements, including reopening Cuba's embassy in Washington, D.C., and reopening the U.S. Embassy in Havana. Here today, as I mentioned, we have Mark McLeod, who is the Director of Latin American Studies and Associate Professor of History at Seattle University. He teaches courses on human rights in Latin American history, in the history of Cuba, history of Mexico, and the revolution in Latin America. He also lived in Cuba for more than 2 years in the 1990s. He was one of the first scholars to receive a Fulbright Fellowship from the U.S. Department of Education to conduct research in Cuba and was affiliated with the University of Havana. His research explores social and cultural history of the modern Caribbean. He has published numerous articles on these subjects and is currently working on a book about immigration and race in Cuba. He holds a BS and an MA degree from the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, another fine Jesuit university, and a PhD in history from the University of Texas at Austin. So before we bring up Professor McLeod, I just want to remind you that he's going to have a presentation, and then there will be an opportunity for all of us to engage in questions. Because this is being videoed, we do ask that you write down the questions, and we will bring the mic to you before you begin speaking so that we can capture all your good questions and thoughts. So with that, please join me in warmly welcoming Professor McLeod.
Thank you very much, President Roberts, and for that kind introduction. Thank you, Larry, for inviting me to speak tonight, and then most importantly, thanks to all of you for coming to listen. So I'll plan on talking for roughly 45 minutes, a brief overview of U.S.-Cuban relations with a particular focus on recent changes over the last decade or so, and then we'll see what kind of questions you might have. So let me go ahead and we will call up our PowerPoint here. Great. Thank you. To start things off, to kind of frame our exploration of U.S.-Cuban relations, I put up a quote from the historian who I think it would be fair to say is the most prolific, most well-known historian of Cuba. This is Lou Perez. where he's written that, and he raises the issue, do the United States and Cuba enjoy ties of singular intimacy in which there's a particular ambivalence there? And these apparent contradictions in which there's trust and suspicion, esteem and scorn, a desire to emulate, and a need to repudiate, at least from the Cuban perspective. And since I do want us to definitely consider the Cuban perspective here tonight, I put that up for us to consider. The second part of the quote, I think, is just as important because he identifies a dynamic that has been at work in U.S.-Cuban relations going back for at least a century, and certainly have characterized U.S.-Cuban relations under the revolution, and that's the U.S. resolve to attempt to control Cuba or to assert its influence and authority over Cuba, and in turn, Cuba's effort to resist that. And I think that's a dynamic that is still very much at work, even as we are embarking on an era of normalization of relations between the two countries. Anybody happen to recognize this individual? I do identify him there on the left. So this is Jose Marti, and he is Cuba's national hero. Cuba's George Washington and Thomas Jefferson rolled into one. And he was the leader of Cuba's independence movement at the end of the 19th century. At the time was Cuba's most prolific writer, and he wrote on a wide variety of topics. And in the 1890s, he lived in exile in the United States, especially in New York City. So he was able to experience the United States firsthand. And one of his more famous quotes, and certainly one that is repeated not only in Cuba, but very much in Latin America, because he is considered to be a Pan-American intellectual, is his quote, "The scorn of our formidable neighbor who does not know us is our America's greatest danger." And by our America, which he said in Spanish, Nuestra America, he was referring to Latin America in particular. Now, that was back in 1891. The previous quote that we had just seen, of course, from Lou Perez a century later, echoes this same sentiment in terms of how critical the role of the United States would be for the people of Cuba. Now, as President Roberts mentioned in the introduction, I am a historian of Cuba. So even though today I will be talking primarily about the United States and Cuba in the contemporary period, since I suspect that's what most of you are most interested in, given what's been changing since December, I would be remiss, since I am a historian, in not mentioning a few things about U.S.-Cuban relations in historical perspective. So this is a very brief history of U.S.-Cuban relations, in fact, so brief that I'm not really going to talk about any of these particular points that I put up here, but I do want to raise them in case during the question and answer session you have any particular questions about Cuban history. And that way my colleagues in the history department won't feel that I'm letting them down. But a couple of things I will highlight there as well is what we see, and this would be roughly from the 19th century up until the present day now with diplomatic restoration, but leading up to the revolution in particular will be the extreme influence of the United States in Cuba. Going back to what's known in the United States as the Spanish-American War, I suspect that all of you have heard about that particular event. That's not the terminology that is used in Cuba or in Latin America for that matter. It's oftentimes referred to as the Spanish-Cuban-American War, or in the case of Cuba, it's our war for independence. So even in terms of how the naming of this seminal event that really launched the United States to, kind of began the American century of the 20th century, the United States has adopted that event and excluded Cuba from the naming there. With the Platt Amendment in the early 20th century, the United States was authorized under international law to intervene in Cuba and did so on multiple occasions until the Platt Amendment was abrogated in 1934. The early 20th century was also a time in which U.S. investment, U.S. businesses came to dominate the Cuban economy and especially the all-important sugar industry, so hence King Sugar. And I mention all of this by way of leading up to the revolution itself, where historians have long debated why did the Cuban Revolution occur? And in particular, what set in motion the most radical, long-standing revolution in the Western Hemisphere. And most historians, most scholars agree that while there were various factors, peasant grievances, an urban underground, the charismatic leadership of Fidel Castro. The most historians agree, and the most widely used textbook on the revolution stress that it was a sense of radical nationalism vis-a-vis the United States that lay at the root of the Cuban Revolution. So we are living with those legacies, and when we try to understand and analyze the nature of U.S.-Cuban relations today, it's important to recognize that radical nationalism. One way of viewing it will be a prominent billboard that is outside of what used to be the U.S. interest section in Cuba, in Havana, and as of this July is now the new U.S. Embassy. For those of you who don't speak Spanish, it says, "Imperialist sirs, we have absolutely no fear of you." And this has long been one of the most photographed, most iconic revolutionary propaganda billboards that is there. And it speaks to this issue of radical nationalism and the relationship between the United States and Cuba. To contextualize and put into perspective the most recent changes in the U.S.-Cuban relationship under the Obama administration, it's worth stepping back and looking at some of the policy changes that were enacted during the first decade of the 21st century under the administration of George W. Bush as related to the war on terror. So President Bush in 2003 appointed a commission for assistance to a free Cuba. It was headed by Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice and Commerce Secretary Carlos Gutierrez. They came up with a range of recommendations to influence domestic affairs in Cuba. And their stated goal was to bring about a peaceful regime change on the island as quickly as possible. So some of the measures, some of the policy changes that occurred beginning in 2004 was a limit on the number of annual visits by Cuban Americans. So prior, under the Bush administration, Cubans going to visit relatives could only go for a period of 14 days and do so once every 3 years. Prior to that, there had not been limitations on family visits. Likewise, the amount of remittances that people in the United States could send back were limited to family members and limited to $300 per quarter, $1,200 per year. There was a cancellation of many of the cultural exchange licenses that had proliferated during the 1990s in terms of study abroad programs, in terms of religious or athletic or artistic visits to Cuba. So many of the organizations that had licenses to bring people legally to Cuba did not have their licenses renewed, and most new licenses were not being granted. So the people-to-people exchange that had arisen during the 1990s was reduced significantly. There had been annual migration talks between the U.S. and Cuban governments. For years, those were suspended by the United States in 2004. A particular measure, maybe a minor one in some regards, but I bring it up because it personally affected me. The U.S.-based presses or editorials were prohibited from publishing works that included Cuban scholars. So I had been actually working in conjunction with a group of scholars internationally who worked on Cuba, some based in Europe, myself in the United States, somebody in Canada, and a handful of Cuban scholars, and an edited collection that we had worked on, which had been received or approved for publication, never went through. For people who violate travel restrictions going to Cuba, it had long been known that although heavy fines were a potential penalty, that the U.S. government generally did not prosecute, did not follow up on violations unless somebody was really trying to make a political statement in violation of the travel embargo. Beginning in the middle decade, the 2004, 2005, the government began, actually appointed 2 federal judges to start working through the backlog of embargo violations and to therefore enforce it much more thoroughly. Radio and TV marquee, two media that project signals to Cuba to try to influence public opinion there, systematically are jammed by the Cuban government. And in this same time period, the U.S. government provided additional funding and actually the use of military aircraft flying in the Caribbean to try to circumvent the Cuban government's jamming mechanisms. And then, perhaps ironically or contradictorily, beginning in 2000, the U.S. government authorized the sale of agricultural goods as well as some medicines. So even as there was a long list of measures undertaken to try to tighten the embargo against Cuba, there was an opening in terms of the opportunity for U.S. companies to export agricultural goods as well as some medical products. And of course, during the question and answer session, I'll be happy to elaborate on any of these points. President Barack Obama, of course, ran on a platform of changing the relationship between the United States and Cuba and potentially opening things up. And in 2011, shortly before his reelection, one of his public statements was, "I would welcome a real change from the Cuban government. For us to have the kind of normal relations we have with other countries, we've got to see significant changes from the Cuban government, and we just have not seen them yet." So then the question in some ways becomes, well, what's changed? Well, why has the Obama administration now, in the intervening 4 years, decided to seek this rapprochement to improve relations with Cuba? And I would say a lot has changed internationally, in the international climate, and we could talk about that. Things have changed domestically, including the fact that in the re-election year of 2012, President Obama received a majority of the Cuban American votes in Florida. But also just as important, and yet something that is not so widely covered in the mainstream media in the United States, are the changes that have been taking place in Cuba. So that's the perspective in particular that I hope to share tonight. So I want to go through some recent reforms in Cuba, political reforms, economic reforms, what I'm calling civil and social reforms. As we're going to see, many of these reforms overlap in terms of their impact, but for ease of presentation, I've divided them up that way. And what I would say is they amount to what I term in my classes, for instance, when I teach history of Cuba, a relentless gradualism. So for many critics of the Cuban Revolution, and for that matter, the majority of the people living in Cuba, they would like to see more and they would like to see it go faster. And yet we are unequivocally seeing a steady process of reform and change in Cuba since Raul Castro took power, and especially since the 6th annual Congress of the Communist Party of Cuba, which was held in 2011, that very same year that President Obama was saying, we need to see some change. So what kind of changes have been taking place in Cuba in recent years? Political reforms. It's worth pointing out that the Communist Party of Cuba, which was supposed to have a Congress every 5 years, had not had one since 1997, and then they finally had one in 2011. Due to various reasons, especially the severe economic recession that Cuba has been in basically since the 1990s, but also due to the transition in power from Fidel Castro, due to health-related reasons, to his brother Raul. But they are planning in April to have their 7th Congress. And the key point here would be, when I discuss the different types of reforms or changes that have been taking place in Cuba, the political ones are the most limited. And yet there are signs that the Cuban government is open to considering some political reforms, and that some very well may be on the table in the next party Congress next year. Among them, Raul Castro, who we have seated here, himself has proposed term limits as well as age limits on the high-level office holders in Cuba. His suggestion was 2 5-year terms would be the max. I don't know that he's ever specified age limits, and considering that he is now 83, it'll be interesting to see what idea follows up. But even if there haven't been meaningful political reforms to take place in Cuba in recent years, there has been a political opening and a sense of openness in terms of the type of issues that can be considered and that can be discussed publicly. For instance, prior to the Six-Party Congress in 2011, the Cuban government convened an unprecedented series of assemblies and meetings and kind of public fora where they solicited the input from actually tens of thousands of Cubans. Now, the decision-making is still coming from above, without a doubt, and yet for the first time, the leaders of the government seem to be interested in soliciting input and getting ideas from the Cuban public. So that was a very telling change. More recently, just this year, one of the two main newspapers in Cuba, this one is Juventud Rebelde, or Rebel Youth, published an online survey where they also included comments, and they asked people to ask questions about the process of political change and to make suggestions. And some of the ones that have come up included direct election of the president and also the possibility of recall. And these are options that were never on the table in the past, and the government certainly would not have provided a public space to discuss them, and yet that has been happening more recently. Just this month, the government has indicated that they are soon to pass a new general elections law. They haven't indicated what it's going to be, but it has raised a lot of interest and hope amongst the Cuban public that there actually might be some meaningful opening or movement towards a greater, I guess, a less authoritarian state would be the way to put it. There already have been a decentralization of some government functions, especially taking some of the decision-making power of national level centers and institutions and handing them out to at the provincial and municipal level. Cuba does have a legislative branch that most scholars would say is merely a rubber stamp organization. The Communist Party decides what the laws are, and then the legislature, the National Assembly, essentially approves them. There has been significant talk, and including from Raul himself, that the National Assembly perhaps should play more of a role in terms of the lawmaking process. So it'll be interesting to see next year, it really is a moment of change, what types of reforms might come out of the next Congress. Last but not least, we've gone on this transition from Fidel stepping down when he was ill in 2006, being replaced by his brother Raul first on an interim basis, and then elected by the Council of State to become the Prime Minister and President, to the point where Raul has said that he will step down when his current term expires in 2018. Maybe it has something to do with the age limits. He will be 87. But he has also already earmarked his successor, the first vice president who he was just appointed in 2013, Miguel Diaz-Canel, who's sitting next to him there. So there is a good possibility that may be the next leader of Cuba, but it remains to be seen. And again, we could talk about that more during our Q&A. What about the economic reforms? The economic reforms have been more significant and much more concrete than the political reforms. And they have been having an impact on daily life in Cuba. The majority of Cubans still live in the countryside and engage in some sort of agricultural work, and there's been significant agricultural change. In the height of the revolution during the 1980s, when the state controlled more than 90% of the Cuban economy, most of the agriculture was in the hands of state-run companies or agricultural collectives. Now, Cuba, despite being a very agricultural country, has had trouble feeding itself, and approximately 50% of the foodstuffs consumed on the island are imported. So Raul and the other leaders realized that's something that is not sustainable. So in an effort to try to promote agricultural production on the island, they have now offered long-term leases to private citizens to work fallow land. Because they also recognize that about 20% of the land on the island was not being used for productive agricultural purposes. More than 3 million acres of land in the last 5 years have been put into production by private Cuban farmers. So it's a remarkable shift in terms of policy, but also an ideological shift in terms of the Cuban government moving away from an extremely centralized economy to one that in many respects, and especially as seen through agriculture, is much more of a private-public hybrid, and the land leases are one. One of the big problems that persisted, and even when the land was made available to private Cuban farmers, was getting the food to where people needed to eat it, and especially the urban centers. So the reforms in the first year or two actually proved to be counterproductive. There was less food in farmers markets in the cities, and food was going for a higher price, primarily due to transportation bottlenecks. So most recently last year, the government established wholesale produce markets on the outskirts of Cuban towns and cities where farmers can bring in their goods and then they are distributed. Prior to that, there were no wholesale markets. If you were growing the goods, you were selling them yourselves. They've likewise allowed for and even provided financing to support a trucking cooperative to help deal with the problems associated with distribution of agricultural products across the island. Another major change that has taken place, and again, one that really illustrates a shift in terms of the government's approach and ideology, has been an intentional reduction in the size of the workforce. In Cuba in the 1980s, early 1990s, even when I was living there, the party line was that our successful communist system provides jobs for everybody. Nobody's unemployed. We have 100% employment, and it's through the state. Everyone knew that wasn't entirely true. It's become all the more true with the economic recession that has ravaged Cuba since the 1990s. So the Cuban government has declared that in 5 years, the intention is to have 50% of the workforce in private business. A remarkable shift from the revolutionaries' long-standing goal, complete state employment. Now the goal is 50%. Maybe too ambitious. Currently, it's now about 20%, and most of that has occurred in the last 5 years. And yet it's very telling that the government is not merely just allowing a range of private economic activity, but is actively encouraging it and setting the goal, hey, we want 50% of our people working for themselves in 5 years. In order to help that, there's a range, I think it's about 190 or so different types of economic activities whereby Cubans can now engage in private economic practice. And there still are hefty fees that Cubans need to pay to be licensed to engage in private economic activity, and yet fees have gone down, and many of the restrictions that used to be in place, the bureaucratic hurdles that Cubans had to go to run their own businesses, those have been reduced as well. So we are seeing a significant shift in terms of the nature of the Cuban economy. In the 1990s, when I was living in Cuba, two of the main forms of private economic activity that were allowed were operating restaurants out of one's house, paladares as they were or are known in Cuba. There were restrictions involved, again, hefty fees as well as licensing, but also they could only be family employment. The idea being they did not want to return to exploitative capitalist relations where you have people who are utilizing the wage labor of others. That has changed, and now people who are running their own private businesses can hire non-family employees. They are promoting private construction in particular to deal with housing crisis. They are shifting within state-run industries to performance-based salary systems, and they are talking about reducing, actually they already have been reducing, and possibly eliminating the state-run ration system, which has been a mainstay of the Cuban economy under the revolution, where Cubans were guaranteed at least basic subsistence in terms of bread, in terms of milk, in terms of some of the other basic goods that they consume. So they're moving away from that type of, again, centralized economy. Now, how about these, what I'm calling the civil and social reforms? One of the most important are eased travel restrictions for Cubans to leave the island. And here they definitely connect with economic reforms. As I mentioned, they do overlap. In the past, Cubans needed to get the dreaded white card, the tarjeta blanca, which was an exit permit. And they had to get multiple signatures to do so, and it came at a very hefty price tag, especially for Cubans. I think it was in the hundreds of dollars. I could be wrong on the exact amount, but they always complained that it was too expensive. And for many Cubans who were considered to be a possible flight risk, those doctors, athletes, a lot of times they might have been prohibited from getting one of these exit visas. The Cuban government has changed that. They no longer need to get the white card, the exit permit, and they are also allowing Cubans to go abroad for up to 2 years and then can still return and occupy their houses, keep their bank accounts, and keep any of their access, for instance, to education or health care. Now, why are they doing this? Is it just in terms of a political opening? Perhaps. But I think much more because the amount of remittances that are sent back from Cubans living abroad are critical to the Cuban economy. In fact, remittances bring back, and estimates vary, but anywhere from $1 to $2 billion a year. So the idea being that Cuba does have a very highly educated and employable population. The jobs aren't there on the island itself. By allowing Cubans to go abroad and then work and send money back, it will give a significant boost to the Cuban economy. Likewise, as part of the travel reforms, those who had left the country illegally in the past had been generally prohibited from returning to the island. Now the Cuban government has declared an openness to allowing them to return. Whether they want to return permanently or whether they want to return on a part-time basis, perhaps living in a summer home, knowing that they will also be bringing hard currency back to the island. There is now a legal real estate market in Cuba. One of the interesting things I saw while living there in the 1990s, you didn't have people buying and selling houses. People definitely wanted to move to Havana because that's where most of the economic opportunity was, relatively speaking. And so you would see signs saying "se permuta," which basically means we're going to trade. So you could trade title to homes, but you couldn't pay in cash. Now, most people understood under the table there probably was some money or an old 1957 Chevy being traded to offset the value of one home or another, but there was not a financial real estate market. Now there is, and that's changed in the last couple years. Cubans, especially in the 1990s, were generally prohibited from entering many of the tourist zones, including the tourist hotels, unless they worked there or had some kind of inside access. Now, if they have the money, and many of them do not, but for those of them who do, especially, for instance, those who might be getting remittances from abroad, they have access to tourist hotels, they could rent cars, they basically can take advantage of what is the most vibrant sector of the Cuban economy, and that's the tourist sector. Cell phones, computers, and DVDs have been legalized. Again, there is a financial block, and not all Cubans can purchase these items. But prior to that, their sale, their availability had been tightly controlled. That has now been opened. Now, in terms of what is allowed to circulate on the internet, there definitely still are tight controls by the government, and there still is censorship there. That said, there has been a proliferation of social media, including Cuban bloggers. Anyone happen to recognize the individual up there? Larry does. So,
I cannot remember.
So she's won numerous international press awards. Yoani Sanchez is her name, and her blog is called Generation Y. She is critical of the government, but by the same token, even as she has traveled around and she has spoken frequently in the United States and elsewhere, she has no interest in leaving the island, and she insists that she is somebody who will be a critic from within. And she is the most visible of many. And unfortunately, the link doesn't show up very well on our slide here. But if you go to the website translatingcuba.com, there's a group of people who translate many of the Cuban bloggers into English. So even if you don't have Spanish reading abilities, you could follow some of the Cuban bloggers and how they are commenting on present-day realities on the island. Where does that lead us? So there's been these range of changes, range of reforms that have taken place in Cuba in recent years. And I think that has definitely contributed to the fact that now the U.S. government is modifying its approach towards Cuban relations. The Obama administration prior to 2011 had rescinded the restrictions from the Bush administration so that Cubans could visit family members without any restrictions. Likewise, they could bring back as much money or send back as much money in terms of remittances. And in fact, any U.S. citizen can send $2,000 per year to individuals or groups in Cuba. And so those were changes by 2011. Licenses, once again, were granted by the U.S. government for cultural exchange, people-to-people exchange programs, education abroad, church visits, athletic and artistic visits, and there was an increase in charter flights to Cuba. Most people, I don't think, realize the degree to which there continues to be contact, or has long been contact between the United States and Cuba, despite the diplomatic opposition between the two countries. There's more than 100 flights a week that travel between the United States and Cuba, and that number is only likely to increase. The most recent changes, the ones that we've been reading about since December of last year. In December 17th, 2014, as you probably know, Presidents Castro and Obama simultaneously held news conferences to announce that there would be an effort by the two governments to normalize relations and to restore full diplomatic ties. So we are right in the midst of that ongoing process, and it has been moving forward since December. When it was announced, in particular, there was an exchange or release of prisoners. There was an exchange of 3 convicted Cuban spies who were able to return to the island, and then Alan Gross, a USAID employee, as well as a U.S. intelligence asset who had been in prison for 20 years, were able to come back to the United States. And Cuba released 53 prisoners that the United States identified as political prisoners. So they did not leave the island, but they were let out of Cuban prisons. So that was kind of what happened immediately in December of last year. Since then, there's been an easing of travel and trade restrictions. There are now 12 categories whereby U.S. citizens can legally travel to Cuba without getting a specific travel license from the Department of Treasury. And I will say right up front, and I anticipate there may be questions afterwards with regards to travel, the travel restrictions have not been lifted in their entirety. One cannot legally travel to Cuba merely as a tourist, and yet the categories are so broad, the reasons whereby people can legally travel, that it makes it possible for most people, if they really want to go, that they could travel legally. In the past, U.S. citizens could not use credit cards or ATM cards drawn on U.S. banks. They couldn't get travel insurance, or they wouldn't be covered by their own health insurance if they needed it on the island. That is all changing as well. Remittances have now been increased. Anyone can send $2,000 per quarter to individuals or groups in Cuba. There's an effort to establish direct phone service between the United States and the island. Time permitting, during the Q&A session, I could potentially tell one of my more humorous stories trying to keep in touch with my wife when I was there in the early 1990s, and how challenging that was as the calls needed to be routed through Canada. The most recent and most important and latest steps in terms of U.S. policy change for Cuba has been the removal of Cuba from the state-sponsored terrorist list, which needed to be done before we could reestablish embassies, and it also affects Cuba's ability to get financing to purchase items from Cuba, for Cuba to get financing to purchase items from the United States, including the agricultural and medicine goods that I referred to previously. So that was back in May, I believe, and then near the end of July, the two countries converted what had been interest sections and really were kind of embassies in all but name, but then formally converted them to embassies in a symbolic step of reestablishing full diplomatic ties. There are pending policy issues. So even as we are living in a time of significant and momentous change between the United States and Cuba, there are some significant issues that remain to be worked out between the two countries that will be difficult to work out, and they probably will not be resolved anytime soon. Most importantly, Cubans insist that for normalization to occur, the United States needs to lift the economic embargo, what Cubans refer to instead as the bloqueo, or the blockade, to refer to it. The flip side is the claims of many U.S. citizens and corporations, and especially Cuban exiles in the United States, for properties that were expropriated by the revolutionary government. The Cuban government counters in terms of claims that they can calculate the costs of 5 decades of a U.S. economic embargo, and they suggest that it's been more than $1.1 trillion in damage that it's inflicted on the island's economy. So Cubans have also put that on the table. Are we going to be reimbursed for the suffering that U.S. policy has imposed on us? As I'm sure you know, especially in conjunction with the war on terror, the U.S. continues to operate a naval base in Guantanamo Bay in eastern Cuba, and against Cuba's wishes, of course. And that's going to be yet another issue that negotiators inevitably will have to confront in the coming years. And last but not least, there is a host of bilateral issues on which there actually has been regular communication over the years and over the decades between the two governments, but they are issues that the two governments will continue to have to cooperate on. Relating to the environment, and especially when we saw the oil spill with the Deepwater Horizon, concerns in terms of bilateral, or the two governments cooperating in terms of environmental damage in the Caribbean Sea. There's ongoing issues with migration, drug trafficking, and yet other ones. So there are pending policy issues that will need to be worked through. And yet, again, symbolically, and many of you, if you did not see this picture, were aware of the brief meeting that took place this past April in Panama at the Summit of the Americas, where for the first time since the revolution, the leaders of the two countries met face-to-face for a meeting. And so that's suggesting, very symbolic again, that we are witnessing something that truly is historic. Conclusions, things to think about. What are the prospects for further normalization of relations between Cuba and the United States, especially given those pending policy issues that I mentioned? We could talk about this more during the Q&A period. I would leave it with the phrase that I often use. It's probably overused and trite, and yet I think it is appropriate here, and it's the one that I share with my students: cautious optimism. I wouldn't expect anything to happen rapidly anytime soon, for instance, with regard to the lifting of the embargo. The embargo, as you may or may not know, has been codified since 1996 with the Helms-Burton Law as an act of Congress. So the full embargo can only be lifted by an act of Congress, not using the leeway or the latitude of executive enforcement, which the Obama administration has done for the types of changes that have taken place in the last, since December. And at least given the current political makeup of the House and the Senate, it is unlikely. I would also suggest that the upcoming elections, and including the presidential elections, can certainly or will certainly have a significant impact on this process of normalization, whether the process continues to go forward steadily and slowly, or even if the process gets reversed. So the elections will be critically important. And just to throw out there, what will be the nature of the relationship between Cuba and the United States in the future? I guess here I have in mind the quote that we began with. Not sure if I could run forward to it. Yes, I can. We enjoy ties of singular intimacy, ones characterized by ambivalence, but Cuba and the United States arguably have been two countries that have had a closer, more intimate relationship than any other country with the United States. Mexico, of course, might have a claim to that. And my wife, who's Mexican, would insist that I bring that up. But when one considers, for instance, that the population of Cuba is 11 million, and there are 2 million Cuban Americans, Americans of Cuban descent living in the United States, it just gives you a sense of the magnitude of the ties between the populations of the two countries. And I think inevitably there will be a strong relationship there. The question is, what will the nature of that relationship be? Thank you.
So thank you very much. He's agreed to take some questions for us now. You can ask a question yourself. Just raise your hand if you want to ask a question. Somebody will come running around with a microphone, or if you prefer, you can write your question on the card and again raise your hand and give it to us, and we will ask the question for you. So, Mark, are you ready for questions?
I'm ready for questions.
There we go.
You mentioned about using U.S. health company insurance in Cuba, which makes me wonder, because I heard that they have a wonderful socialist health system, so it wouldn't even be necessary, would it? Please explain.
Sure. So certainly one of the great successes of the Cuban Revolution, and I think even critics would acknowledge that in two areas in particular, education and healthcare, the revolution has been very successful. One of the problems, however, is that, or the major problem is with what's known as the special period, and I didn't mention that, maybe I was remiss. So when the Cuban economy collapsed, in part with the fall of the Soviet Union, so beginning in the 1990s, precisely the years that I was living there, it became known as the special period in times of peace. That was one of Fidel's famous phrases. And his notion was that this is a special period. It's almost like we're at war. We have to be on a wartime footing due to the severe economic crisis that we're facing, even though we're technically at peace. So that's the backdrop to say that the Cuban healthcare system suffered severely with the special period, with the economic crisis, and faced and continues to face severe shortages in terms of basic supplies. So there is a very highly educated public health workforce. In fact, Cuba continues to export doctors and other healthcare professionals to other countries in the world, and especially in the Americas, Venezuela, Brazil, Nicaragua, elsewhere. So that knowledge is there. But a lot of the basic supplies are not available, and so there is to some degree a dual healthcare system that has emerged where if you have access to hard currency, what Cuba uses now, dollars have been outlawed since 2004, but the hard currency, so Cuba has a dual currency. So you have what's known as convertible pesos, the pesos convertibles. They translate, their acronym is the CUC, so they call them the CUCs, which sounds great in English, the CUCs. They're also known as chavitos by Cubans on the street. So if you have access to the hard currency to get convertible pesos, then you could pay for medicines, but they are in more limited supply. So if you're traveling and you don't have access to health insurance, realize that you're probably going to have to pay out of pocket to get the top quality healthcare that the Cuban system is capable of providing, but due to the economic crisis over the last 2 decades, it hasn't been as readily available for all Cubans as it might be. So good, I think that's an excellent question.
I've got 2 questions. Real simple one, which agricultural products primarily were the ones that were sent to Cuba, sold to Cuba? And then in the 60s, Cuba had strong ties with the Soviet the bloc, USSR. I'm curious how the relationship has continued on with Russia currently.
Okay, good. Two great distinct questions. In terms of the products exported from the United States to Cuba, the agricultural products in particular, I'm not sure offhand, but the one in terms of the percentages or the amount, soy will definitely be one. Corn will be another one. And really, it's basic foodstuffs for feeding the Cuban population, and and also for livestock. So I'm trying to think. I mean, it's mainly those, and what I've read in terms of potential changes moving forward if trade restrictions are lifted, or if they continue to follow this pace of change, that the agricultural industries, the farmers of the U.S. Southeast will benefit the most. Because then they're going to be, in terms of transportation costs, they're going to be, be able to take advantage of the opportunity there. I should mention, just kind of elaborate before, since I was trying to keep my talk to 45 minutes, I wasn't able to provide all the details. One of the problems with being on the state-sponsored list of terrorism was that the Cuban government did not qualify for purchasing on credit from the United States. That now will be possible, and the Cuban government is heavily in debt. And does not have the type of economy where they have the money to typically pay up front. They still have been. The United States is Cuba's 5th largest trading partner, in spite of the fact, again, that we have this image that relations have been broken between the two governments. We are the 5th largest trading partner, in spite of these many hurdles, in spite of these many restrictions. Now that the Cuban government will be able to buy on credit, the expectation is that that trade is going to increase, and the United States will become an even more important trading partner moving forward. Cuba and the Soviet Union. Yeah, so with the collapse of the Soviet Union, relations between Cuba and Russia, Cuba and the Soviet Union back then, Cuba and Russia now, soured considerably. The Soviet bloc used to purchase Cuban sugar at a heavily subsidized rate, and also provide petroleum in particular. So in the special period when I was living there in the 1990s, there were regular scheduled power outages, and at times it was common, for instance, to maybe only have power for 2 or 3 hours during the day, and not necessarily reliably, just because there was such a lack of fuel on the island, given that their traditional trading partner since the 1960s had gone away, and also the fact that they were trading, they were receiving favorable rates in terms of trading sugar for petroleum. How else can I elaborate on this? So in living in Cuba, one thing that stood out when you were watching the evening news, you could guarantee that there would be at least one report that shed the United States in a negative light. Whether it was crime or corruption or whatever, you'd also get one from the Soviet Union. So just kind of illustrative of how that relationship broke rather quickly. So yeah, I think I'll leave it at that, and we could always follow up if you have further questions.
Hi, thank you for speaking to us. Are any of the reforms that have been proposed by Raul Castro at all inspired by how modern communist governance is practiced in China?
Excellent question. Very much so. And observers of Cuba, scholars of Cuba, when the changes began with the special period in the 1990s, I've looked at it and said, how is Cuba going to make a transition away from communism? Will they follow a Chinese or a Vietnamese model? Back then, the Soviet transition model was perhaps still on the table. Without a doubt, when we look at the economic reforms that are taking place and the fact that really within the last 5 years in particular, the Cuban government is embarking on reforms that are bringing about a hybrid mixed economy between public and private, at the same time that they are trying to hold on to political power in terms of the Communist Party, suggests that the Chinese model is very much one that they're emulating. And I think also just, keeping in mind some important differences, and especially the vast size and power of the Chinese economy with a very, in terms of the industrial or agricultural resources that the Chinese economy can tap into, that the Cuban economy just does not have access to. Roughly 75% of Cuba's economic activity, GDP, is in the service sector. And so tourism is critically important, and yet Cuba does not have the agriculture or the industrial base to really carry out the types of reforms that we've seen that have fueled such massive, rapid economic growth in the case of China. So the effort to undergo this process of economic reform while still holding on to political control will have that added challenge.
Medical tourism is a growing reality due to the high cost of medical care and treatment in the U.S. What are the costs comparably in Cuba, and what's the likelihood there might be some business opportunities?
I will confess that I don't consider myself to be an expert on this, so in terms of the exact cost, but I would say that probably is one area where there will be potential. Again, the Cuban healthcare system is relatively advanced. They have put a significant amount of resources into biotechnology, and the Cuban government does see it as one area in particular where they may have a comparative advantage. It might be one sector of the economy that they might be able to develop. In terms of the ins and outs, it's not my area, so I wouldn't be the consultant there. But bottom line, I do think that is definitely one of the areas that the Cuban government sees as a possible growth area. And given that U.S. pharmaceutical companies already have relationships with the Cuban government, since that's one area where since 2000, with restrictions, and again, buying on credit, the Cuban government has been purchasing from U.S.-based pharmaceutical companies. So I don't know, does that fully answer the question? But the bottom line, without being able to get into details, is I do think that is one area where there will be potential trade and investment opportunities.
I'm old enough to remember why we went to Guantanamo to begin with. We were trying to fight the U-boat problems. We were trying to fight the U-boat problems in the Atlantic, and it made good sense. Why are we still there? Do you have any ideas about that, and can we get the hell out?
Good question. So I will say this, you remember Guantanamo, you're not old enough to remember when it was established, because it was established in 1903. And so in fact, it was part of the Platt Amendment that I had put up there earlier as a condition for the U.S. military and with the Spanish-Cuban-American War. U.S. Marines occupied the island and took over the government from 1898 to 1902 and insisted as a precondition for turning over the government to the Cuban people that they accept the Platt Amendment into their own constitution. And the Platt Amendment authorized the United States under international law to intervene in the internal affairs of Cuba. And by one vote, Cuban leaders accepted it, thinking independence, even in compromised fashion, is better than nothing. but also part of that agreement established the U.S. right to run naval and coaling stations on the island. So Guantanamo actually goes all the way back to 1903, did play a very prominent role in World War II. Since the revolution, the Cuban government does not recognize the U.S. right to the naval base. I've done research in the city of Guantanamo, and it borders the largest active minefield in the Western Hemisphere. And the Cuban government, the U.S. government continues to pay the annual rent check for the naval base. Still, I think, based on 1959 numbers, and the Cuban government refuses to cash the checks. In fact, I've read from accounts of people who have visited, or over the years, visited with Fidel Castro, that he literally keeps the checks in the drawer of one of his desks, and he's showing the checks to more than one person. So that's the backdrop to all of it, and why are we still there? At least up until recently, it served a very strategic purpose, but now the modern age of technology and transport and warfare, the U.S. military probably does not need it. We've closed other bases. We've turned over the Panama Canal Zone to Panama. We've closed Vieques in Puerto Rico. So the opportunity is probably there, and of course, with the war on terror, it has become a base for a prison camp for. And I just heard a person was released today, and there are now 119 people remaining at the Guantanamo Bay Naval Base. President Obama did run on a platform of planning on closing it. Hasn't gotten there, obviously due to domestic politics in particular. So to answer your question, that's the main reason. But as I put up there in terms of pending policy issues, it's not one that gets brought up all that often in talking about what the U.S. and Cuban governments still need to work through. But I think it's definitely going to be on the table. And it probably is one of the I actually think it'll be one of the easier ones to solve, given that there are many in the United States that want to see it closed.
I'm wondering about the class system, I guess, there in Cuba. So I'm assuming with the relaxing of some of these policies and that more and more people will be allowed access to privatization or businesses, but I'm assuming that that's also gonna, the people who get access to it probably already have some of the means already, and then that's gonna create kind of, I'm assuming create, do they want to create a middle class, or is, and I guess I don't obviously have a formulated question, but I'm just curious about how that's working and how the people are responding to it. Are they excited and liking this idea, or is it causing some concern and some strife between classes?
So,
does that make sense?
It absolutely makes sense. The quick answer is both.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you asked that. Since the special period in the 1990s, as Cuba began to embark on these reforms, but they've really picked up pace in the last 5 years, there has definitely been a growing disparity in terms of access to currency, access to hard goods, and that runs counter to revolutionary ideology. Now, many Cubans are excited about the opportunities that offers, especially considering the challenging economic situation that they've been facing for a quarter century now. But there are also many who are concerned that it runs counter to what have been the basic principles of the revolution. So while I was living there in the 1990s, I repeatedly heard from people, and typically, and again, since I wasn't a tourist, and so I wasn't staying in tourist hotels, and I was interacting, I was at libraries, I was at archives, I was staying with friends, or I was staying in state-run hotels for the Ministry of Education. So having those, those kind of conversations, and frequently I would hear, we struggled for this to bring about a more equitable system. Something has to be done in the midst of this economic crisis, but we don't like seeing that people who have access to hard currency are the ones who are able to survive this special period better than others. And especially because, well, why do they have access to hard currency? For some, because they are working in the tourist sector. And so you saw many people, college professors, doctors, who were driving cabs in addition to, or even rather than, the professional jobs they had trained for, because they would earn a significantly larger amount of money. But the other way people were getting hard currency was from remittances. And so you had many saying, you know, these are people who left the island, they gave up on the experiment, and now they're sending money back, and it is leading to this divide. That's going to be one of the ongoing challenges, in a way related to your question, that Raul Castro and government leaders are going to have to navigate. Because these types of economic reforms seem to be necessary. At least they have arrived at the conclusion that they need to open up the economy and create more of a market economy, but it is going to lead to a greater inequality, which is something that, more than any other country in the Western Hemisphere, the revolution did manage to compress the gap between rich and poor.
Well, I'll ask maybe the elephant in the room question. Can you talk to us some about travel to Cuba? I definitely am interested. I am a single woman that would travel alone probably, and I'm wondering if it's best to go through the official 12 apparent categories and go with some kind of tour group or something, or if it is possible to do it on my own.
Okay.
We all want to ask about travel.
So let's see. So questions on travel. Obviously, the group travel will be more expensive. So that is one of the questions to factor in, and it also might not provide you with the type of autonomy or freedom in terms of traveling on your own. Given the 12 categories that are there, it's not required that you have to be as part of a group to fit in with them. Among them, for instance, are to explore economic opportunities, for instance, import-export projects. Academics, journalists, people who are attending, are going for sporting, religious, humanitarian projects are authorized to travel with a general license. So it's possible for individuals to fit within one of the categories. Considering this is being taped in particular, I'm not going to say that you should just go and ignore the travel restrictions that remain. That said, it's estimated that more than 100,000 U.S. citizens who are not Cuban Americans, who are not visiting family, traveled to Cuba last year, even before these changes were set in motion. So there has been a steady stream of visitors to Cuba. Undoubtedly, many of them have not been licensed. And it's estimated that more than 500,000 Cuban Americans go every year. I've been hearing from friends and colleagues that the number of U.S. visitors is going up notably, to the point where some have had trouble getting rooms to stay. So something worth pointing out. One of the most meaningful reforms that has been carried out in that regard is Airbnb announcing, one of the very first businesses to announce that they were going to move into Cuba, and they have already done so. From the perspective of the U.S. traveler, that's great, because now you could pay up front with credit cards. When I was there in the 1990s, there were no credit cards, there were no ATM machines, and I lived there for as long as a year, so it meant I was carrying around all my cash for a year. Now you can use credit cards, but even better, you could pay up front through Airbnb. From the Cuban perspective, it's great, because Cubans who rent out rooms need to pay an upfront fee in order to be licensed on a monthly basis, and if they don't have enough occupancy, they actually could lose money. So now they're guaranteed up front. They know, who's going to be coming and who's already paid up front. So something like Airbnb, which by the way is a great way then to interact with Cubans in terms of their everyday experience, is kind of solves that. You could stay at tourist hotels, which inevitably are joint projects between the Cuban government especially the Cuban military and foreign companies. So there is that possibility, but it will be more expensive and it won't afford the same opportunities for face-to-face interaction. You did mention traveling as a single woman, so I feel I should comment on that as well. Obviously, one needs to always be careful when traveling anywhere, including here in Seattle. Havana, or Cuba in general, would be relatively safer than almost any other place that you would visit, due to the ongoing political control that the state maintains. Crime has increased with the economic crisis since the 1990s, but it tends to be petty crime, robbery, theft, not as much violent crime. Cubans lament the degree, when I was living there, they would say, oh, this is terrible, crime's becoming so bad. One of the more popular songs that was being played when I was there in 1990s by a singer-songwriter, Carlos Varela, is called Todos se roban. Everyone robs, everyone steals. And he runs through all these different instances of people robbing. So that crime has gone up, but in general, it's not violent crime. And there is a government presence or a police presence, which I think generally would make it a safer place for women to travel, single women to travel, compared to other urban areas, for instance, Havana, and especially in the developing world. So.
What's the relationship between Cuba and China now?
Increasing. Cuba, again, is not only, I think, looking at China as a model to emulate, but there are different areas in which Chinese companies or the Chinese government has been exploring opportunities for investment. That said, perhaps less than one might expect. China, and this is where I'll step back and kind of speak more about Latin America more generally. Chinese trade and investment in South America has been much more significant, to the point where some scholars are suggesting that we're kind of seeing this shift in terms of the geopolitical landscape, where Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean continue to be the U.S. backyard, but South America, in terms of Chinese economic influence and involvement, and therefore, in turn, political and diplomatic leverage is increasing. So it's been growing, but by way of example, it hasn't come close to replacing the role of the Soviet Union in from the 1960s to the 1980s. I think the Cuban government is definitely seeking more of a multilateral engagement with the wider world. At least until recently, has relied heavily on Venezuela, again for the subsidized petroleum imports. But now that the Venezuelan economy has fallen into recession, that relationship, I think, is probably loosening a little bit. And that, by the way, would be one of the international factors that I alluded to in terms of why is this happening now in terms of the normalizing of relations. There's reasons for the US government and also the Cuban government to seek better relations between the two countries. And I think one of them is Cuba, for instance, losing its most important partner. Not losing entirely, but the support from Venezuela. Another good example would be the degree, for instance, to which Brazilian investment is planned for Cuba. Now, there's been maybe some of you are aware of the corruption scandal with regards to Petrobras and the impact that that's going to have on the Brazilian government and the Brazilian economy. So who knows? But in particular, a Brazilian company is planning, and actually I think has even started working on developing a deep sea container port facilities at the port of Mariel, which is just outside of Havana, kind of seeing it as the logical transshipment point for people who are going to be using the new expanded Panama Canal, which is being expanded under Chinese investment. So.
Predominance of English speakers
In terms of traveling.
in terms of traveling.
So, predominance of English, good question. It's certainly been growing. When I was there were probably as many Cubans whose second language was Russian rather than English. For those traveling, and especially for Cubans who are working in the tourist industry or related to the tourist industry. They generally have basic knowledge of English. And already there's been a whole new generation of young Cubans who have come of age and gone through an educational system where they've recognized that that tourism is the future and English is the future. So the younger population in particular, the percentage of English speakers is going to be a lot higher there. So.
This is more towards the U.S. side. You said there were restrictions, the Bush administration had put restrictions on publishing Cuban scholars. I'm trying to figure out why that wasn't a First Amendment violation, or why it wasn't considered one.
Maybe we should have sued. No. And it wasn't just Cuba, by the way. It was scholars from any country that was on the state sponsor of terrorism list. But affected me personally, which is why I put it up there. And it's not one that made headlines because it didn't necessarily affect a lot of people. My guess would be you could publish elsewhere. But you can't be publishing, in a U.S. press. So I don't have an easy answer there. The other big controversy, if you will, related to this in the academic world was the refusal to grant visas for Cubans to participate in academic conferences on U.S. soil, which is often how we interact. The Latin American Studies Association, which is the largest interdisciplinary conference for people, or association for people who are involved in Latin American studies. They hold a conference every 18 years, and at this time it was scheduled for Puerto Rico, actually, for San Juan. Traditionally, the U.S. government would grant visas to the vast majority of Cuban participants. Some might be denied, thinking that they had a more prominent role in the Communist Party or for whatever reason, but the majority of Cuban scholars were allowed to attend. At this time, and I can't remember the exact year, it might have been around 2006, basically there was a blanket denial of the visas. So the Latin American Studies Association signed a letter of protest. The next meeting was actually to be in a U.S. city. It was to be in Boston, and they looked at the finances to see if they could cancel it, and they did, and decided to move the meeting to Canada, for instance. So that's kind of a related issue in terms of efforts to prohibit these people-to-people exchanges. And coming back to that question, what will the nature of the relationship between the two countries be? It comes back to, let's see, do I still work? No, I'm off, but that's okay. I wasn't able to go back. It's okay. What's the nature of the relationship? Is it one of engagement? In which the U.S. government or the U.S. people interact with Cubans in an effort to try to influence the system there and influence human rights issues, for instance, or is it one of attempting to control, to go back to Lou Perez's quote from the very beginning? And Cubans continue to argue that we will gladly move forward with this process of normalization, but to do so as equals with dignity and respect, and not to be told what to do. You may or may not have seen one of the most recent issues, and one, again, that suggests that we may be undergoing a process of normalization, but we are certainly not there yet. The Cuban resolution to denounce the embargo that annually is voted on in the United Nations was held just earlier this week, and by a vote of 191 to 2, the United Nations denounced the U.S. embargo as a violation of international law and international rights. And it was the United States and Israel that voted in favor of it. The Obama administration, prior to the resolution being voted on, indicated that the U.S. government might actually abstain from the vote rather than voting against it, which would have been very symbolic. But they said that they could not abstain given the language of the resolution. So they actually asked the Cuban government to modify the language, and that didn't happen. So suggesting that we are, still in a process that can move in different directions. And I think that really comes back to these very issue that Lou Perez mentioned right up front in terms of, once again, I'll move back here. Oops. Oh, when I get to the end, it's doing it on me. Okay. The North American, the U.S. resolve to control Cuba and Cuban determination to resist control. And I think the vote at the United Nations, illustrate that this is an ongoing dynamic of the relations between the two countries.
And I assume that dynamic is still in flux, considering that that dynamic is still in flux because we're on the verge of our own major shift in politics here in the United States, and in listening to, not wishing to name names, some wish to return. So how fragile is it? I assume that the reforms that are happening very quickly now are still fragile and can be, or is there any sense that something might now hold, even with the regime change here in the United States?
For the domestic reforms that have been taking place in Cuba.
Yeah.
So I think it's much more likely that the economic reforms will continue out of economic necessity and the degree to which there has been this steady process. And again, that's very significant because in the 1990s, there were certain openings when I was living there, but there was always this sense amongst the Cuban people, kind of this reluctance. We don't know if it's permanent. Too often we've had, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and this reluctance that, hey, we open up our own business, is the state going to take it over at some point in the future? It does seem, again, this kind of gradualism, but I mentioned this relentless gradualism. This is a slow, moderately paced process, but it does seem like it's gained enough momentum that the economic reforms are unlikely to be reversed. The political reforms are a whole nother issue, and as I mentioned, there's been more discussion of possible political reforms rather than actual concrete changes that have been carried out. But without a doubt, and I alluded to that before as well, the upcoming elections might very well be critical in terms of whether or not we continue to move forward with this process of normalization. I have long said, and students ask me, why after 50 years do we still have this embargo? And I ask the same question too. Given that the stated goal is to bring about regime change and get the Castros out of power, at some point you have to ask, is this, is it working? And from living in Cuba, I could say, if anything, it ran counter to the stated goal, because it served as a constant reminder that the Cuban government can bring forth that this is why we are facing these problems. Yeah, we're in the special period. It has nothing to do with our system or the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's due to the bloqueo, the economic embargo. And yet the U.S. policy towards Cuba has very much been a question of domestic politics, possibly as much, if not more so, than foreign policy or foreign relations. And we've all seen how important hanging chads can be in a swing state like Florida. That says something. And that also helps to explain the timing. The Obama administration carried out some very small steps, as I indicated on that one slide, prior to the re-election, but then afterwards has moved much more heavily. The majority of people, there's many polls that have been conducted since the announcement in December of the process of normalizing, and they generally run between mid-60 and mid-70% of the people in the United States who would like to see a normalization of relations and even a lifting of the blockade and travel restrictions. The majority of Cuban Americans now say the same thing. And as mentioned, Obama won the Cuban-American vote in Florida. So I think he has recognized that this is an opportunity to take this kind of step because it is politically feasible to the degree that it was not previously.
Mark, I have a question here from the audience on trade. She wants to bring you back to trade. Talking about the trade restrictions, I know you referred earlier to the movement of trade from the U.S. in the agriculture and medical trade, but what other products are moving from the U.S. or potentially could move from the U.S., and what products from Cuba could potentially be moving into the U.S.?
Okay, great. So in addition to agricultural and pharmaceutical trade, the two areas that the U.S. government have identified as ones that they see that are promising and they want to facilitate in particular, the first one will be telecommunications and especially internet technology. And so restrictions have already been lifted in those areas. The other one will be, in fact, building supplies. Kind of basic supplies to support private businesses on the island. And I didn't get into all of these details. Even as private economic activity was opening up going back to the 1990s, there was no wholesale market for supplies. So as with so much of the things revolving around life in Cuba, you had this basic contradiction where you are allowed to open up a business, but you can't get supplies legally because only the state is authorized to get the supplies. Going back to this notion of everybody robs. And so that has changed. So now private individuals, entrepreneurs in Cuba can purchase supplies from state warehouses or from state entities. And yet there is anticipated to be more demand than the Cuban government can meet. And so construction materials, building supplies is definitely one of the other ones that's been identified by both governments as a possibility. That said, I'm sure there are a lot of other items that Cubans will be interested in, and again, I think especially high tech, because it's one area in which Cuba is significantly behind, and telecommunications, as mentioned before. As far as importing items from Cuba, that's again one of the challenges, given that so much of the Cuban economy focuses on service. Perhaps bringing in highly educated doctors and nurses and other healthcare professionals. Cuba has attempted to try to jumpstart, if you will, or the sugar industry, which up until the 1990s had been the most important sector of the Cuban economy, going all the way back to the late 18th century. Tourism replaced sugar as the main source of foreign exchange revenue in the 1990s, and a lot of the sugar mills fell into decline. Cubans consolidated many of the mills to take advantage of spare parts. Most of the mills were built by U.S. companies early in the 20th century. But there has been a renewed effort to try to develop the sugar industry once again. There's going to be other types of tropical products like coffee and, of course, tobacco, as we all know, associated with Cuba. As far as industry goes, the main one will be nickel. And so Cuba does export nickel. Now that said, there has been a decline in the international price of nickel recently. So one of the 3 nickel mines on the island was recently closed. But there's that potential possibility as well. And by the way, it's a Canadian company in particular that is the main trading partner for the nickel that Cuba produces.
Do you have time for one more question?
Absolutely. Yeah, I have time for more than one.
Actually, you get the second to last word. He gets the last word.
You mentioned the 1957 Chevy, but Cuba's only about the size of Pennsylvania. It was a long time ago that the cars were being imported. What kind of volume is there of antique automobiles that might be repatriated to the U.S.?
That's already been going on, if not to the U.S. And in fact, even when I was there in the 90s, the Cuban government started, and this is a government-run company, so a state-run company began buying some of the cars that were in better condition and exporting them, whether to the United States or in this case, it wasn't directly to the United States, to third countries. Beyond that, and I suspect that the supply of ones that are in better condition is probably quite limited. What's more interesting and more remarkable is how creative and inventive Cubans can be in terms of keeping old cars running with a unique range of spare parts, considering, even apart from the fact that there's a trade embargo, these parts aren't being produced anymore. So you see Cubans literally using airplane parts or getting parts from Soviet Ladas or whatever they can to make sure that their cars are still running. And those cars in particular are used by Cuban taxi drivers. So not the ones in the tourist industry. Those are generally going to be newer imports, Mercedes or BMWs or others. But for taxiing Cuban clients around, they'll pile into those old American cars.
Okay, it's come to closing time, and I hope you've all enjoyed Professor McLeod's remarks, and let's please give him another round of applause.